On a Tuesday evening in October of 1988, Dale Whitmore stood at the edge of a drainage ditch in a field that was not his, watching a $500,000 combine sink slowly into soft ground, while the farmer, whose land it was, stood nearby saying nothing useful. And the longer he stood there, the more it became clear that this was no longer a demonstration. It was a situation that had already gone wrong and was continuing to move in the same direction without stopping. The combine had broken through at the edge of the ditch, where the ground looked firm from a distance, but had been holding water underneath for weeks. And now its weight had settled into the soil in a way that made every attempt to pull it out feel less like recovery and more like making the problem worse. The front end sat low, angled slightly toward the ditch, while the rear wheels had already sunk deep enough that the mud had begun to wrap around the lower half of the tires, gripping them instead of letting them turn, and every minute that passed made the ground softer, not firmer. Behind it, the recovery truck sat with its engine still running, a steady mechanical sound that had been constant for the last 2 hours. And the cable that had been pulled tight again and again now hung with a slight slack that said more than any explanation could have. It had already been tried, more than once. One of his service technicians walked up beside him and spoke in a voice that had lost the confidence it carried earlier in the afternoon, when this had still been something they believed they could handle. "We're out of options for tonight," he said. Whitmore did not respond. He kept his eyes on the machine, not because he expected it to move, but because looking away would have meant accepting what he was already starting to understand, which was that this was no longer something he could fix with what he had brought into the field. The light was beginning to drop across the horizon, stretching longer shadows across the uneven ground, and what had started as a controlled demonstration earlier in the day had turned into something else entirely, something quieter and more uncomfortable, especially now that the 6 potential buyers who had been standing nearby just a few hours earlier had already left. They had not stayed to see how it ended, and neither had the confidence that had been present when the demonstration began. The technician waited a moment, then stepped back, leaving Whitmore alone with the sound of the idling engine and the sight of a machine that had been meant to represent reliability now sitting still in a way that suggested the opposite. And 3 years earlier, on a bright afternoon at the Redwood County Farm Expo, Dale Whitmore had stood in front of a group of men and laughed at a tractor that was older than most of the people listening to him, and he had said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that it belonged in a scrapyard, not on a farm. He had not thought about it after that day. He had not needed to. The man who owned that tractor had, and in about 4 hours that man was going to get a phone call. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this, the kind where something seems settled until one moment shifts everything in a way nobody expects, take a moment to subscribe, because what happens next is not about the machine in the ditch. It is about the man who is going to decide whether he wants to help the person who once stood in front of a crowd and laughed at him, and if this moment already feels like it is leading somewhere, you are right. By the time the light dropped low enough to stretch across the field and soften the edges of everything in sight, they had already tried everything that should have worked, and what had started as a manageable situation earlier in the afternoon had slowly turned into something that no longer responded to effort, because the problem was not the machine anymore. It was the ground itself holding onto it in a way that did not give anything back once it had taken hold. And the longer the combine remained in that position, the more it felt like the field had decided it was not going to release it easily. The first attempt had been made when the combine had only just broken through at the edge of the drainage ditch and still looked like something that could be pulled free without much difficulty, and one of Whitmore's service trucks had been positioned directly behind it with a heavy tow strap rated well above the weight of the machine, the kind of setup that had handled similar situations many times before without complication, and at that moment there had been no reason to believe this would be any different. The strap tightened gradually as the truck pulled forward, the engine rising in sound as the driver leaned into the throttle, and for a brief moment it looked like the combine might respond, because there was a slight shift in the frame that suggested movement was beginning. But before any real progress could happen, the truck itself lost traction, its rear tires spinning against the same soft layer of ground that had already given way under the combine, and instead of pulling the machine free, the truck began to dig itself down, sending wet soil outward as the ground failed beneath it. They stopped, repositioned, and tried again, adjusting the angle slightly in an attempt to find a stronger line of pull. But the result did not change, because the issue was not the angle or the strength of the strap. It was the condition of the ground itself, which could not hold under pressure no matter how carefully it was applied. A second service truck was brought in, and this time both vehicles were connected to the combine, their combined power expected to overcome the resistance that had stopped the first attempt, and for a moment there was a renewed sense that this would be enough, because two engines working together had solved problems like this before. The straps tightened harder, the engines strained louder, the drivers held steady, and the combine shifted just enough to create the illusion that it was about to come free. But the ground responded in the same way it had before, giving just enough to absorb the force and then settling back into place, as if it had adjusted itself to hold the machine even more securely than it had before. Behind the trucks, the soil tore apart under the spinning tires, leaving deep, uneven tracks that filled with moisture as quickly as they were created, and with each failed attempt, the area surrounding the ditch became softer, weaker, and less capable of supporting any further effort, which meant that every attempt was not just failing, it was making the situation worse. By the time they stopped, the field no longer looked like it had earlier in the day, because the clean surface had been replaced by disturbed ground, broken patches of soil, and tracks that showed exactly where force had been applied and where it had failed, and the combine, still sitting in the same position, looked more settled than it had before. That was when Whitmore called the recovery company, and when they arrived just before dusk, with equipment designed specifically for heavy extractions, there was a brief return of confidence, because this was no longer a general solution. It was a specialized one, and the operator who stepped out of the truck carried himself with the kind of calm that comes from experience in situations that most people only see once or twice. He did not rush into the setup. He walked the ground first, moving slowly around the combine, studying the angle at which it had sunk, the depth of the wheels, and the way the soil responded under his boots, and each step he took seemed to confirm something he already understood, because he was not just looking at the machine, he was reading the ground beneath it. After several minutes he chose his position and began setting his anchor, placing it carefully in a location that appeared more stable than the areas that had already failed, and as he worked, the technicians stepped back, giving him space, because this was no longer their attempt. It was his. The cable was attached, the system tightened, and when the pull began, the difference was immediate, because this time the combine moved not just slightly, but enough to show that the approach had worked in a way the earlier attempts had not, and for a brief moment the field seemed to shift in favor of the people trying to recover the machine. 2 feet, maybe a little more. Enough for everyone watching to feel the change. Enough for Whitmore to believe just for a moment that this was about to be over. But the ground did not hold. The anchor began to move under the load, not collapsing all at once, but shifting gradually, just enough to reduce the tension in the system. And once that tension dropped below the level needed to continue the pull, the entire operation lost its effectiveness, leaving the combine in nearly the same position it had been in before, except now the surrounding soil had been disturbed even further. The operator stepped back, his attention moving from the machine to the ground and then back again, and there was nothing in his expression that suggested there was another option available with the equipment he had brought, because he understood what everyone else was beginning to accept, which was that the problem was not the machine and it was not the tools, it was the condition of the ground itself. By 7 in the evening, the field had gone quiet in a way that did not feel temporary, and the combine, now sitting deeper than it had been when the first truck arrived, had taken on a kind of stillness that suggested it was no longer going anywhere that night, and the absence of movement made the situation feel heavier than it had earlier, because there was nothing left to try. Whitmore had made 8 phone calls by then, reaching out to every heavy equipment operator he could think of, and every answer had been the same. Either they could not get there until morning, or they did not have anything that would perform better than what had already failed, and with each call, the number of options became smaller until there were none left that made sense. One of his technicians had been standing off to the side for some time, watching the field and the machine and the way the situation had unfolded, and when he finally walked back over, there was something in his expression that suggested he had been holding on to an idea he was not entirely sure he should bring up. "There's one more option," he said, and even though his voice remained steady, there was a hesitation behind it that came from understanding what he was about to suggest. Whitmore turned slightly toward him, waiting. "Gus Pelletier," the technician said, and the name settled into the space between them in a way that carried more than just the possibility of a solution. Whitmore did not respond immediately because the name was familiar in a way that did not belong to this situation, and for a moment, the problem in front of him and something from 3 years earlier existed together without fully connecting. The technician continued, explaining that Pelletier had a 1952 Farmall with a custom-built rear winch system that he had built himself, something he had used for years to pull stumps and move heavy equipment across difficult ground, and that, more importantly, he understood how to anchor in soft soil in a way that did not rely on force alone. There was a pause after that, not because the idea lacked merit, but because of what it implied. "It's either that," the technician added, "or we wait until morning and hope it doesn't sink any further." Whitmore looked back at the combine, at the way it sat in the ditch, at the depth it had already reached, and at the ground around it that had been disturbed enough to make waiting feel less like a solution and more like a risk. And for a moment, the decision in front of him was not just about solving the problem, it was about choosing who he would have to ask for help. Then he reached into his truck, picked up the phone, and stood there for a moment before dialing, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood that this call was not going to be like the others he had made that evening. At that same hour, a few miles away, Gus Pelletier was in his barn finishing the kind of work he had done at the end of every day for as long as anyone in the county could remember, moving slowly around the Farmall with a wrench in his hand while checking what needed checking and tightening what needed tightening, and everything about the way he worked reflected a level of familiarity that only comes from decades of knowing exactly how a machine behaves under use and how it responds when something begins to change. The barn carried the steady smell of oil and worn metal, and the quiet rhythm of tools being picked up and set down filled the space without demanding attention, because nothing about the evening was unusual, and nothing about the moment suggested that anything beyond it was about to interrupt what had always been a routine that did not change. Then the phone rang inside the house, and although Gus did not hear it immediately because of the work he was focused on, it rang a second time, and his wife answered, her voice carrying faintly through the open barn door as she spoke, and then paused long enough for the tone of the call to shift from ordinary to something that required his attention. She stepped into the doorway and called his name, and there was something in the way she said it that made him stop what he was doing without asking any questions, because after all these years he understood the difference between a call that could wait and one that could not. "Dale Whitmore is on the phone," she said. Gus did not respond right away, but instead set the wrench down carefully and wiped his hands on a rag that hung over the edge of the bench, taking a brief moment before moving, not because he needed time to think through the situation, but because the name itself carried a weight that did not require explanation. He walked into the house, moved past the table, and picked up the phone, holding it to his ear for a second before speaking in the same calm tone he used for every call. "Gus?" Whitmore said, and whatever confidence usually defined his voice was absent, replaced by something quieter and more controlled, as if he understood that this was not a moment he could manage the way he normally would. "I need help." Gus did not answer immediately, and the silence that followed was not hesitation, but attention, because he was listening to more than just the words. He was listening to the way they were said. "What kind of help?" he asked. Whitmore explained the situation, describing the combine, the ditch, the failed recovery attempts, and the way the machine had settled into the ground, and as he spoke, the explanation came out without the structure or confidence it might have carried earlier in the day, because there was no advantage left in presenting it as anything other than what it had become. Gus listened without interrupting, without reacting, and without asking questions, allowing the explanation to reach its end before he spoke again, because the details themselves were not the difficult part of the conversation. When Whitmore finished, there was a pause that held long enough to be felt, and in that pause, there was something else present that neither of them needed to name, because it had already been established years earlier, in a moment that had passed quickly for one man and stayed with the other. "That's a bad situation," Gus said. "Yes," Whitmore replied. Another pause followed, and this one carried more weight than the first, because what came next was not about the machine, it was about the space between them that had existed long before the call. "I know I don't have any right to ask," Whitmore said. Gus said nothing, and the silence stretched in a way that could have ended the conversation if it had been left there, but it did not, because Whitmore continued. "But I'm asking." From the kitchen doorway, Gus's wife watched him, not because she expected a particular answer, but because she understood that whatever he said next would not come from the situation alone, it would come from something deeper than that. Gus lowered his gaze slightly, not in uncertainty but in consideration, and for a brief moment nothing in the room moved. Because the decision was not being made in response to the request, it had already been shaped long before the phone rang. "Give me 45 minutes, he said. There was no explanation attached to it and no condition added, and before Whitmore could respond, Gus set the phone back in its place. His wife stepped forward and looked at him. "You going?" she asked. "Yes," he said. She studied him for a moment and then asked the question that had already formed the moment she heard the name. "Why?" Gus reached for his jacket, lifted it from the hook, and paused just long enough to answer in a way that did not need to be expanded. "Because that combine didn't call me scrapyard material," he said. "The man did." Then he turned and walked back toward the barn. By the time Gus pulled the Farmall out of the barn and guided it onto the narrow gravel road that led toward Whitmore's field, the night had settled in enough that the air carried a steady chill that pressed lightly against his face, and the headlights cut a narrow path ahead through the darkness, while the low, familiar sound of the engine moved in a rhythm that had not changed in decades, steady and consistent in a way that reflected not just the machine itself, but the man who had kept it running all those years without ever depending on anything beyond what he could understand with his own hands. The gravel shifted under the tires in a soft, repetitive pattern, and the surrounding fields stretched out on both sides in long, flat darkness, broken only by the occasional farmhouse light in the distance. And nothing about the drive felt urgent on the surface, because Gus did not rush, even in a situation like this, and the speed he chose was not based on the problem waiting ahead, but on the way he had always done things, which was to move at a pace that allowed him to think clearly rather than react quickly. His nephew sat beside him on the metal seat, holding onto the side rail more out of habit than necessity, and although he had climbed onto the tractor without asking many questions, there was a quiet awareness in the way he looked ahead that showed he understood this was not just another trip across the county because the tone of the evening had already changed before they left the barn. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the steady pull of the engine and the faint crunch of gravel beneath the tires. But as the lights of Whitmore's field began to appear in the distance, the nephew shifted slightly and finally said what had been sitting in his mind. "They already tried pulling it, didn't they?" he asked, not because he doubted it, but because he knew what that usually meant when something like this reached the point of a phone call. Gus nodded once, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead, and after a moment he answered in a way that did not rush and did not try to simplify what he was explaining, because he was not speaking to fill silence. He was speaking to make something clear. "They pulled from fixed points," he said, "and in ground like that, fixed points don't hold the way people expect them to, because all the force goes straight into the top layer, and the top layer is always the weakest part when it's been holding water for too long." The nephew listened carefully, following not just the words, but the tone, because Gus never explained anything unless it mattered, and after a moment he responded with what seemed like the obvious conclusion. "They had stronger equipment than this," he said. Gus nodded again, and this time there was a slight shift in his voice, not disagreement, but correction. "They had stronger equipment," he said. "But strength isn't what that ground needs, because when you pull too hard against soft soil, you're not moving the machine, you're breaking the ground that's supposed to hold your anchor, and once that ground fails, it doesn't matter how much power you have, you've already lost your advantage." He let that settle for a moment, then continued, not as a lecture, but as something remembered. "My father learned that the hard way," he said, "lost 2 tractors in one season because the anchor gave out before the machine ever moved. And after that, he stopped thinking about how to pull harder and started thinking about how to make the ground hold." The nephew turned his head slightly, looking at him now. "So what's different about yours?" he asked. Gus adjusted his grip on the wheel, the movement small and natural, and answered without looking over. "The anchor spreads the load," he said, "wide plate instead of a single point, so the force doesn't go into one spot, it spreads across the surface, and when you spread it out, the ground has something to hold on to instead of something to give way under." He paused briefly, then added the part that mattered more than anything else. "And you don't rush it," he said, "because that kind of ground doesn't let go when you tell it to. It lets go when it's ready, and if you try to force it before that, you just make it hold tighter." The nephew nodded slowly, not because he fully understood every part of what Gus was saying, but because the way it was said carried a kind of certainty that did not need to be questioned. By the time they reached the field, the work lights had been set up around the combine, casting a pale, uneven glow across the disturbed ground, and from a distance the machine looked larger than it had during the day. not because it had changed, but because the darkness around it made everything else feel smaller. Gus did not drive straight toward it. Instead, he guided the Farmall along the outer edge of the field, keeping a distance that allowed him to see the entire situation without stepping into it immediately. And as he moved slowly around the perimeter, the path he chose was not random, because he was not just approaching the machine, he was studying the ground from angles that the earlier attempts had not taken into account. Whitmore stood near the edge of the lights, watching him, and there was something in the way he remained still that showed he understood this was not the moment to step in or offer explanation, because whatever needed to be understood was already being worked out without words. The technicians stood nearby as well, their earlier confidence replaced by a quiet attention that followed Gus's movement across the field, and none of them spoke because there was nothing to add to what they were seeing. Gus completed the slow arc around the combine, then brought the Farmall to a stop at a distance that did not seem significant to anyone else, but was exactly where he wanted it to be. He climbed down without speaking and walked toward the south side of the ditch, placing each step carefully, not because the ground was unstable under his weight, but because he was reading it, feeling how it responded, how it shifted, how it held. He stopped once, bent down, and pressed his hand into the soil, holding it there long enough to feel the resistance and the moisture beneath the surface. And when he lifted it again, the dirt clung slightly before falling away, confirming what he had already expected. He stood and looked across the ditch, not at the combine alone, but at the relationship between the machine and the ground, the angle of the frame, the depth of the wheels, and the way the earlier attempts had changed the surface around it. When he walked back to the tractor, he did not explain what he had seen, because there was nothing about it that needed explanation, and instead he adjusted the position of the Farmall slightly, moving it into a line that did not match any of the previous attempts, placing it at an angle that changed the direction of force in a way that worked with the ground instead of against it. He stepped down again and moved to the rear, lowering the anchor plate into position with a motion that showed no hesitation, because this was not something he was trying. It was something he had done enough times that it did not require thought, and once it was set, he pulled the cable forward, guiding it toward the combine with steady hands. He chose his connection point carefully, attaching it lower on the frame than the earlier attempts had, positioning it in a way that would allow the pull to lift slightly as it moved instead of dragging directly through the softest part of the ground. Whitmore stepped closer then, stopping just outside the space Gus was working in. "Do you need anything?" he asked. Gus shook his head once, not looking up, because everything he needed was already there, and anything else would only complicate what he had already decided. He climbed back onto the Farmall, settled into the seat, placed his hand on the control, and for a brief moment nothing moved, because everything had already been set, and what came next depended on how it was applied, not how fast it began. Then he engaged the winch. When Gus engaged the winch, the movement that followed did not come with the kind of force that had defined every previous attempt that evening, and there was nothing in the sound or motion of the machine that suggested he was trying to overpower the ground, because what he was doing was not built on strength. It was built on understanding, and that difference showed itself immediately in the way everything remained controlled from the very first moment the cable began to take tension. The line tightened slowly, not snapping into place, but drawing firm in a way that allowed the load to settle evenly, and the anchor plate behind the Farmall pressed deeper into the surface without shifting, spreading the force across the ground instead of driving it into a single point. And as that tension held steady, the entire system reached a balance that none of the earlier attempts had achieved. Gus did not increase the pull, He did not adjust the throttle to force movement. He held everything exactly where it was, allowing the pressure to remain constant, because he understood that in ground like this, sudden force does not break resistance, it strengthens it, and the only way to release what had already settled into the soil was to give the ground time to respond on its own terms. From where Whitmore stood, there was no visible change at first, and that lack of movement would have been frustrating earlier in the day, when every attempt had been built on the expectation of immediate results. But now it carried a different meaning, because the absence of motion was not failure, it was part of the process. The cable remained tight. The tractor did not shift. The anchor held, and the combine stayed exactly where it was. But beneath the surface, something had begun to change. The pressure was no longer concentrated at the point where the wheels had sunk, and instead of the soil gripping tighter under force, it began to redistribute the load across a wider area, loosening its hold gradually in a way that could not be seen directly but could be felt in the way the system remained stable. Minutes passed, and Gus did not move. He did not look toward Whitmore. He did not check the position of the machine. He simply held the tension steady, because he knew that what mattered was not what could be seen above the surface, but what was happening below it. And then, after several minutes that felt longer than they were, the combine shifted. It was not a dramatic movement, and it did not happen in a way that would draw immediate attention from anyone not watching closely, but it was enough to break the pattern that had held the machine in place, and once that first shift occurred, the resistance that had defined the entire evening began to give way. The front edge lifted slightly as the suction released, and the wheels, which had been held in place by the pressure of the surrounding soil, began to move forward in a slow, controlled motion that followed the same steady rhythm Gus had maintained from the beginning. Whitmore saw it. He did not speak. He did not step forward. He simply watched, because after everything that had already failed, there was no part of him that wanted to interrupt what was finally working. The combine moved another foot, then another. The ground released it in stages, not collapsing but yielding, as if the pressure that had been holding it down had finally reached a point where it could no longer sustain itself. And through it all, Gus did not change anything about the way he was pulling. He did not increase the load. He did not rush the process. He allowed it to continue exactly as it had begun, because forcing the final movement would have risked undoing everything that had already been achieved. Within 10 minutes, the combine reached solid ground. The weight shifted fully onto a surface that could support it, and the tension that had held the entire system together for those minutes was no longer needed. Gus disengaged the winch. The cable loosened gradually. The anchor held its position until the force was gone, and then it settled back into the ground without resistance. The problem was over. And it ended without noise, without celebration, and without anything that would suggest that something unusual had just taken place, except for the fact that the machine that had been stuck for hours was now free. Gus stepped down from the Farmall and began the process of resetting his equipment, coiling the cable carefully and lifting the anchor plate from the ground with the same steady movements he had used from the moment he arrived, and he did not look toward Whitmore or the others standing nearby, because there was nothing in what he had done that required acknowledgement. Whitmore walked toward him, stopping a few feet away, and for a moment he did not speak. Not because he did not have something to say, but because what had just happened had already said more than any immediate words could carry. "Gus," he began, and the name itself carried a weight that had not been there earlier that evening. Gus did not look up right away, and when he did, it was only long enough to acknowledge that Whitmore was there before returning his attention to the tractor. Whitmore hesitated, and in that hesitation was everything that had existed between them for the past 3 years. The comment at the fair, the laughter that followed it, the silence that came after, and the moment now, standing in a field where none of it could be ignored. Before Whitmore could continue, Gus spoke. "Send whatever you think is fair to the Redwood County 4-H, he said, and his voice carried no edge, no emphasis, and no attempt to shape the moment into something more than it was. They need a new workshop. Whitmore stood there, absorbing the words, and in that moment he understood that this was not a transaction. It was a decision that had already been made before he arrived, and there was nothing to negotiate or respond to except to accept it. Gus climbed back onto the Farmall, settled into the seat, and placed his hand on the controls, and as the engine idled, Whitmore remained where he was, because there was still something that had not yet been said. "Gus," he said again. This time, Gus looked at him. Whitmore opened his mouth, then paused, because the words he was about to say did not come easily, and for a brief moment he looked at the tractor, at the machine he had dismissed years earlier without thinking, and then back at the man who had just used it to solve a problem. He could not. "I was wrong," he said quietly, "about the tractor at the fair." Gus held his gaze long enough for the words to settle, and then gave a small nod. "I know," he said. He did not add anything else. He did not remind him of the moment. He did not take anything from it. He started the Farmall and drove away. If you've ever had a moment where you helped someone who didn't deserve it at the time, not because you had to, but because you knew it was the right thing to do, then you already understand this story better than most people. So take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already, because this channel is built for stories like this, and if there's a moment in your life like that, share it in the comments and let me know where you're watching from, because it's always worth seeing how far stories like this can travel.